Is Israel losing as it inflicts a genocidal war on Gaza? Now, on the surface of it, this may seem rather counterintuitive. After all, Israel has the continued patronage of the United States, the world's only remaining superpower, who, despite occasional public hand-wringing about this mass slaughter, continue to provide Israel with the support it needs to continue wiping Gaza off the face of the earth. In recent days, they authorised billions of dollars in bombs and fighter jets, including 2,000-pound bombs, which have been repeatedly used to kill large numbers of innocent Palestinians in one go. That's despite knowing Israel plans an assault on Rafah, where a majority of Gaza's population has been driven to, where even when they supposedly oppose such an onslaught, but they hand over the weapons to make it possible. Now, Israel has destroyed or severely damaged most of Gaza's civilian infrastructure, is increasingly reduced the Palestinian people to starvation, with the most acute famine since World War II unfolding before our eyes. It has inflicted what one UN official describes as the biggest rate of killing since the Rwandan genocide. So, an article in the Jerusalem Post about comments made on Israeli radio by former IDF Major General Israel Ziv is rather instructive, to say the least. He says, Hamas's military capabilities have indeed been damaged, undoubtedly eliminated by the IDF, but they still have thousands of terrorists. The territory in terms of civilian control remains in the hands of Hamas. The organisation is alive and still kicking. He goes on to say, in the absence of a policy, what is the IDF supposed to do? We are over 5 months into this war without any predictable political goal. Let's say we stayed until now. What is next? Even if we stayed and declared that we were occupying, we would become the new government in Gaza. Israel would need to establish civil, police and security systems and take care of the various services. What happened to us is not just a Hamas situation. The lack of decision-making on our part is the most serious thing. He's basically saying Israel doesn't have a strategy at all. I mean, essentially, that's what he's saying. And indeed, the question there he's posing is rather interesting. I would note much of the Israeli establishment has a rather obvious answer to it. You render Gaza so uninhabitable that you drive most of the population out. You make life so miserable and you kill as many people in the process that those who survive wish to flee. And what remains is placed under a brutal, unrelenting military occupation with Gaza parcelled up into zones. But he goes on, this this Israeli former army officer, senior army officer, commenting on Canada's decision to stop arms shipments to Israel, saying Israel is in the middle of a very serious international crisis. I don't remember one like this before. It is a result not only of the lack of advocacy, but also that Israel is in a deep crisis as a result of the lack of policy. There we go again, he's back to lack of strategy. Everything points to the fact that the government does not make policy decisions, and not only do we not know what the best decision is, but the world does not know either. He complains that the world is not being shown what he calls the heroic actions of the IDF. He says they only show photos of the humanitarian crisis, the demolition and the destruction. Well, no shit, because that's what's happening. I mean, first, he's taking the mick here, given how much favourable coverage Israel has got from so many media outlets and how many have failed to show the utter horror of what Israel has actually done to Gaza. Many have had to rely on social media instead. Weird we're not seeing what he calls the heroic actions of the IDF, given the famine, mass destruction of infrastructure, mass death, the genocidal rhetoric of leaders and officials, and indeed media organisations in Israel, and the fact the IDF themselves keep posting their own war crimes on TikTok and online, as well as their general gleeful triumphalism, and then pillaging and posing with the stolen belongings of displaced, maimed and slaughtered Palestinians. Now, interestingly, though, he goes on to say, because of this, the public opinion in the world is against us. The point here is that in the end, he says, the US will not be there for us either because there is a limit to what they are willing to contain. He warns that if Israel goes back to being a nation on its own, maybe we can last a few months. But says Israel wouldn't be able to continue to defeat Hezbollah in the north without backing from its allies, and said we're already in a very serious situation. Israel must make a decision. America doesn't work for Israel, saying they have worked with Israel until now, but America doesn't agree with Israel's policy. When asked about the need to convince the US or the necessity of the action in Rafah, he says we're not ourselves convinced. Asking if Rafah is so important, why didn't we enter anyway? I'm not quite sure about the phrasing quoted after this, because he says, after what happened on October 7th, we proceeded cautiously and with an excess of force. We did not act with exceptional sophistication, and we did not create control. I mean, that seems a little contradictory to me, and obviously there was no restraint there. But crucially, he says, by saying that the IDF knows what to do, but the war is being lost. It has no goals, no direction. If you agree with the path of the government, the problems will continue. If not, please make room for someone else. Really fascinating stuff there. Now, lots there, but this is damning. Bear in mind that Gaza is only the size of East London, and this has been going on for 6 months. 6 months of Israel smashing this tiny strip into little pieces. I mean, I think this portrayal that Israel would be able to, there was talk, I remember, of, the US wanting this all done and dusted by mid-January, and now we're approaching April. A map shared by Charlie Herbert, a former UK general who served in Afghanistan in mid-March, showed only a tiny proportion of Gaza's under current IDF control. Large swathes are in a security vacuum, with the rest controlled by Hamas. In fact, a very significant chunk still controlled by Hamas, according to the map which he shares. Now, he added, reminds me of our old Afghan mapping. Very similar. We thought we had security control. In reality, we only ever controlled a tiny percentage of the country. The remainder was governed by the Taliban. That ended well, didn't it? Well, indeed. And actually, the circumstances are far more fortuitous in the sense for Hamas, in the sense this is obviously the case of a people which have been brutally occupied and suffering this genocidal war, with the resultant desire amongst the overwhelming population of Palestine to be rid of their occupiers. Now, it's worth noting that last month, US intelligence officials told Congress that Israel was not close to defeating Hamas. They added, American officials have also raised doubts about whether the destruction or elimination of Hamas is a realistic objective, given it operates like a guerrilla force hidden in a network of tunnels that are difficult to penetrate. Now, while Netanyahu had publicly claimed to have killed 2/3 of Hamas fighters, US officials thought it was only a third. But there was another crucial point here. They say American officials also emphasise that the United States has learned in war after war that counting the number of enemies killed in an insurgency or counter-terrorism operation is a fool's game. Operations that kill militants often radicalise others, swelling the ranks of enemy organisations. And US officials say death counts of fighters do not give an indication of whether a government has addressed the core issues driving the war. Very, very important points. I mean, what that says is they will continue this war of annihilation, which will just keep exterminating Palestinians. But, well, you can't wipe out an idea. It's stupid to think that a guerrilla force is a static number. If you wiped them all out, there are still other people who've watched their families and loved ones be slaughtered who can take up arms. It doesn't take much training, does it, to be a guerrilla fighter in the grand scheme of things? You need determination. And if you have seen unbelievable suffering and suffered the most horrific injustices, then that will drive you to fight. It's an obvious point which we have learned throughout history, have we not? And which is why the genocidal implications come through, because you keep hearing Israeli officials making this point, and on media organisations in Israel saying they need to kill children because they grow up to be so-called terrorists. But this is a case of they'll just keep carrying on murdering people, because they've already killed around 40,000 people and they haven't come close to killing Hamas. So how many more tens of thousands does that mean? Indeed, Israel's Shin Bet, its domestic intelligence agency, last month declared Hamas would continue as a guerrilla force after supposed military defeat. But that point about public opinion is so important. Israel has counted for so long on the overwhelming support largely of US public opinion for a very long time. That is dramatically changing. A new poll in the US finds a huge shift away from Israel. In November, 50% of Americans said they approved of Israel's military onslaught and 45% disapproved. So now 36 approve, with 55% disapproving. A startling shift, a huge shift, and a shift that's only going to carry on in one direction. Even President Donald Trump, former president, opportunistically sensing an opening, given how Joe Biden's trashed his reputation amongst natural democratic voters because of his complicity in genocide, said, Israel has to be very careful because you're losing a lot of the world, you're losing a lot of support, you have to finish up, you have to get the job done, and you have to get on to peace, to get on to a normal life for Israel and for everybody else. Well, he's clearly looking at which way the winds are shifting there. Israel is looking at a future in which public opinion in the main state which arms and backs Israel is turning against it, which will mean growing numbers of voters will demand an end to military support for Israel and aid, and for the US to use its enormous leverage to force Israel to end its oppression of the Palestinians. Right now, Israel has impunity, and impunity breeds hubris. But I think that Israeli officer has a point. This is a genocidal war. Well, he hasn't said that, which has caused huge amounts of suffering. But it also may prove a catastrophic strategic mistake for the Israeli state. And it clearly hasn't thought that through. Please like and subscribe. Love to hear your comments. Do share this video. Keep sharing the radio on patreon.com/Listen to us podcast. Speak to you soon.